Everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine, and today we're going to be talking about what is probably the single most important and under-discussed problem that we have in the modern world. There is a war that happens in every single one of our lives throughout our childhood, and that continues into our adulthood. And this war is at first psychological and emotional and becomes physiological. And if we don't talk about it, how are we going to do anything about it? So what exactly am I talking about here? What I'm talking about is the topic of the very first article I ever put up on owlchrysalismedicine.com, and it's called The Attachment versus Authenticity War. Attachment and authenticity are two words that get flung around everywhere all the time nowadays, and lots of people are talking about it, which is great. The first thing that we should probably talk about in this is attachment. We're going to have to talk about what attachment is. We'll talk about the types of attachment, what they're for, and we're going to discuss authenticity in a way that maybe you haven't been exposed to before. Because the authenticity I'm talking about is not some self-help, new age woo-woo form of authenticity. This has nothing to do, or very little rather, to do with that kind of woo-woo self-improvement. But it is the foundation of that woo-woo self-improvement. But there is a biological, biochemical substrate to authenticity in the same way that there is a biological, biochemical substrate to attachment. I love the analogy, and I've used it before in this podcast, that oxytocin is the biochemical analog for safety. And if you know much about oxytocin, that's how we bond with each other. It is the bonding hormone. And oftentimes, oxytocin gets touted as just this lovey-dovey, feel-good hormone, but there's more to it than that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about attachment and authenticity and how, unfortunately, those two things don't mix well with each other, especially at a young age, and especially in our modern culture. So, attachment. Let's start with that. What is attachment? So, for a definition for attachment, I'm looking at one of my favorite books, ever. It's Gabor Mate's new book that he wrote with his son, which I find amazing. But it's called The Myth of Normal. One of the reasons I wanted to cover this today is because I was very proud of that article and the concept, and recognizing this inherent rub between all of our needs for attachment and all of our needs for expression of our authenticity. And when I found out that Gabor had a new book that came out, I bought it immediately and immediately started reading it. And very early in the book, chapter 7, he calls a traumatic tension. And it is literally a traumatic tension, authenticity versus attachment. I was so happy to see this in this book because I felt really cool about it. I was like, wow, me and Gabor are on the same page, and it's just very vindicating when you have a concept or an idea and you find out someone else who is does this for a living and is way better at it than you, because it's Gabor freaking Mate. When you have the exact same idea, it's just marvelous. So anyway, that made me really excited and made me recognize that this is a really important topic that I should probably talk about more. Anyway, in this book, in this chapter, the definition that he uses for attachment is He says he uses a colleague's definition of his, Gordon Neufeld. Gordon Neufeld describes attachment as the drive for closeness, proximity to others, in not only the physical but emotional sense as well. He goes on to say its primary purpose is to facilitate either caretaking or being taken care of. For mammals and even birds, it is indispensable for life. So that's what he calls attachment, right? It is indispensable for life, which is not surprising, especially when you look at humans and you realize how incredibly helpless we are when we are tiny. As soon as we come out, we come out of the birth canal, we can only see, it's like 16 to 18 inches in front of our face. Everything's super blurry. We have 100 billion neurons at birth and very, very, very few connections. But we actually start making about 700 connections a second in that first year of life. So we come in very empty and ready to be programmed to be able to fit into any culture, anywhere in the world, in any environment, speaking any language with any number of non-negotiables in our environment. And we'll get to the non-negotiables in a little bit, but non-negotiables in our environment, like it's cold if you live somewhere cold. That's a non-negotiable. It's hot if you live in the desert. And so your body has to adapt to your environment. When we inherit things that allow us to survive and thrive in a given environment, that is culture. That is originally, when we think about it, we think about that as like First Nation cultures are really predicated on surviving and thriving well in the ecosystem that they're in. But then the rest of the modern world has created civilizations that have a lot more terrain to deal with other than just the geographical type of terrain. We have political terrains we have to navigate. We have social and economic terrains that we navigate. When we're born, we expect attachment. We are primed for attachment because over time, nature and evolution has gotten very used to the fact that human beings have a very long child-rearing phase. So we neurologically in our brains expect attachment the same way that our lungs expect air. That's super important. Okay, so what is authenticity? Authenticity is a little harder to describe. It's a little harder to define, but I'm going to use the definition that Gabor Mate has in his book. The definition for authenticity that Gabor uses in his book is the quality of being true to oneself and the capacity to shape one's own life from a deep knowledge of that self. Now, I said the authenticity that I'm talking about today is not just this self-help, like new wave woo-woo form of I'm gonna be me authenticity. That is a downstream manifestation of very primal, basal, physiological needs. We have a need for authenticity. Authenticity is rooted in survival as much as attachment is. And this is what I want you to really get. Authenticity is absolutely as necessary for survival as attachment is. Attachment is more necessary when we're young because it's literally life or death. Authenticity is the root of our survival instincts. In the most pragmatic way, authenticity is really knowing our own gut feelings when they arise and honoring them. Which, how is that survival? If we were if we were back on the African plains and we saw a lion or a bear, or there aren't bears in Africa, at least as far as I know, but if you saw a giant predator and you were not able to access your gut instincts, which operate or on a shorter time scale than our conscious thoughts do, how well do you think we'd survive? Not very well. So authenticity is really, in like the most basic terms, so we can talk about it easily now for this podcast at least, is a very real physiological survival mechanism that is highly associated or correlated with our ability to feel, understand, and express our inner reality, whatever that inner reality is. That's authenticity. And the problem is there's a rub between authenticity and attachment, because as children, we have no issues with our authenticity. We have no issues with expressing our authenticity as infants. Nobody comes into this world, quote unquote, a good person who is was born putting other people's needs in front of their own. No. If you did that as an infant, you would be dead, because your needs were food and shelter and warmth, and you had no issues when you were hungry crying for help. You had no issues when you were cold, shivering and crying and getting your help the way that you needed. You had no issues with that. But over time, that changes. If you ask me, I think that changes through, obviously, parenting and whatnot, but I think the most detrimental changes have happened recently over the last 50, 60 years, maybe even 70, 80 years, because of the way our modern world has changed. Culture, like I said before, the way that we learn to survive and thrive in a given environment is inherited through culture. And our modern culture has many, many, many more terrains to worry about. And with all the science that we've had over the years telling us one thing and then another and then another and then another, especially when it comes to children and how to raise children and keeping babies off of breast milk because formula was better, but then now formula is not nearly as good as breast milk, and the whole letting your baby cry it out thing. All of that stuff was medical interventions at one point that turned out to be seriously detrimental to babies and to families, and which means it's detrimental to our culture. But our culture is one where we are meant to keep producing, to work and work and work and work and work. And we're meant to be happy little workers, and we just do what we're told, and you make the best out of it. And that's fine. Live your life however you want to. The issue is we train our children to do that. And when we train our children to do that at such an early age, because we're trained to do it as adults and as parents, we're trained to ignore our own needs to take care of our baby's needs, to ignore our own needs to take care of our boss's needs or our coworkers' needs, because that's how we get this sense of belonging as adults. We get a sense of self and a sense of identity out of doing those things. But then our babies observe us doing those things, and they learn that they have to do the same thing. So when a baby cries, you feed it. Or you come cuddle with it, you pick it up, those sorts of things. At least that's what we do now. That wasn't what we did for a long time. So we have a generation or more of people now who were trained, neurologically trained. I mean, like their neurological patterns are set up in a way where they're not allowed to feel their own feelings. So how does this happen over time? Say you're a baby and you're hungry, you cry, somebody comes to you. Now, and hooray. Now you're a toddler and you do the same thing, but your parents know that as a toddler, you have much more developmental capabilities than you did as a child or as an infant. So they start expecting more of you. And when you have a need like a need for attention, which is a very real need, that's a part of that attachment. When you have that need for attachment and quality attention from a parent who is tired from working a 10 or 12-hour day, or it's their first day off in 2 weeks and they always work 10 or 12-hour days like my mother, there is no energy for that. So what we get told is mom doesn't have energy for it. So me as the child, then my needs are interpreted as being too needy, that I am now too needy. So what happens is when I have this inner reality of I need something, I need food, I need attention, I need whatever, as that comes up in me, I have to then learn to repress that, because over time, when it comes up, I bring it up and I get told that's inappropriate. For one reason or another, that's inappropriate. That need is inappropriate. That expression is inappropriate. If I feel anger and I express that anger, that's inappropriate. So then I get in trouble for that. That doesn't feel good. So then I try to learn to suppress my anger. When it comes up, I find some kind of narrative that I can then tell myself that allows me to repress the anger. Excuse me, this is still conscious, so it's suppression of the anger. It allows me to suppress my anger. That's the difference between suppression and repression. Suppression is a conscious process, and repression is no longer a conscious process, and it usually happens as a result of continual or chronic suppression of certain things. Usually, in what we're talking about now, it's suppression of negative emotions in a lot of cases. Suppression of our experience of our own needs, suppression of how much stress that we feel we are in, and suppression of our negative emotions. So we have to learn to suppress all of those things, because expressing them doesn't do any good. We don't get those needs met. So expression of our authenticity, which is a fundamental survival skill, gets pushed directly up against our need for attachment. Because if we continue to push when we are angry, or when we are hungry, or when we are sad and we need attention, if we continue to push, that stresses the relationship with the caregiver that literally keeps us alive. That's the rub. That's the issue. Expression of our genuine selves gets in the way of making sure that we are securely attached with our caregiver. And this pattern is then continued for every relationship that we have for the rest of our lives, with ourselves, with our colleagues, with our coworkers, with intimate partners, with friendships. In every single relationship that we have, if we are relating to a person, to a thing, we will neurologically be more likely to do the exact same coping process that we've always done since childhood. That rub between the expression of my authenticity and the need for attachment is the heart of what is called small t trauma. There are big T traumas and there are small t traumas, as far as like the most kind of universal way of looking at it. And basically, there's no comparing the two. There is big T traumas are usually acute and like a singular event. And of course, you can have more than one big T trauma. But those are the kind that we see on TV. Those are the kind that most of the studies are based around. But the type of trauma that has infiltrated our world and is subversively destroying all of the mental health of the modern world, in my estimations. I mean, it's not the only factor, but it is absolutely one of the largest, if not the largest, maybe with the exclusion of foods. The types of nutrients and the types of foods that you ingest. I really believe that this subconscious war between accepting and expressing my authentic self, my authentic needs and desires, and feeling like I belong to a group of people, it's the heart of so many issues in our modern world. So to talk a little bit about how this suppression, repression thing, Gaber has a wonderful study that I had read about a long time ago and forgotten about until I went back through this book. And what they did is, so the myth of normal in general, the front bit of it does a wonderful job of exploring how the coping mechanisms and strategies that we launch in early life eventually become so habituated they become a part of our personality. And then those personality traits that now have been labeled as things like type A, which most people know about. Well, now there is a new type called type C, and it's not even that new. But type C basically is your polar opposite of type A. And the book does a really great job of explaining how all of these processes start and grow and eventually become liabilities to our health. Type A personalities have a liability to their health, but Type A personalities have a liability to their health that is so polar opposite to the issues that Type C people face. Type A personalities they're your go-getters, you're always working, always doing stuff, forever in motion, and always achieving. They are at risk for angina, like chest pain, heart attacks, that sort of thing, while Type C personalities are the exact opposite. Type C personalities are the people pleasers. They're the ones who put everybody else's needs in front of their own. And the issue that I see with our culture is that these Type C personality traits give rise to an incredible number of physiological maladies later on in life, or diseases or disease processes later on in life. Gabor has created a short list of the fundamental kind of traits among Type C, or that create this Type C personality trait. And they are, in no particular order, an automatic and compulsive concern for the emotional needs of others while ignoring one's own. The rigid identification with social role, duty, and responsibility. People are overdriven, externally focused on multitasking hyper-responsibility based on the conviction that one must justify one's existence by doing and giving, which to me really stinks of Christianity. There's also repression of healthy self-protective aggression and anger. How many people are told that you're not supposed to express anger? Like, you can express anger like at home or alone or punching a pillow, maybe. But for the most part, we're told to keep that shit to ourselves. And then he also has harboring and compulsively acting out two beliefs. I am responsible for how others feel, and the belief I must never disappoint anyone. So these are the hallmarks of Type C. And everyone knows and understands how Type A personalities affect physiological health. But somehow, some way, we seem absolutely stuck. We are so determined. We are absolutely immovable on accepting the fact that being a Type C person has physiological downfalls. That it has great adaptation in the short term, and in the long term, it is absolutely detrimental to the body. It blows my mind and frankly pisses me off that we refuse to see this, as a very real health risk. Putting everyone's needs in front of your own doesn't just make you a good person, it makes you a liability to your family, because they're going to have to learn how to function without you, because you're going to die. Not everybody who acts this way occasionally is going to get a melanoma or an autoimmune disease or a metabolic disorder, all three of which are highly, highly correlated with these Type C personality traits. And that's why I love this book. That's why I love Gabor Mate. He's done an incredible job of putting these pieces together. He uses a story for suppression, and how suppression turns to repression, where they took Type A type people who have, they took Type A people, Type C people, and a healthy group, so 3 different groups. And when I say Type A, what they specifically tested were people with heart disease, people with melanomas, and a control group. And what they did in the study was they flashed demeaning phrases. in front of these people. They said things like, "You deserve to suffer. You are ugly. No one loves you. You only have yourself to blame." And they had little pads on people's skin, which is a very common way to test physiological stress responses. And what they did is, after they flashed these things, they had the members of the group of each group talk about how consciously stressed they felt. How stressful was that experience reading those things? And it turns out that the type C personality group, they had a big gap between what they consciously registered as stressful and what their body registered as stressful. So they reported a much lower level of stress consciously than what their body was reporting via the amount of sweat on their skin. And we know that this is a good measuring tool. It's been used for a long time for lots and lots of studies. So we know that works really well, testing people's skin. What this means is that the people with the melanomas had a much higher rate of being disconnected to their own experience. They did not recognize how stressed they were in that situation. They registered consciously that, yeah, it was stressful, but not that stressful. But their body still responded to the stress in the exact same way, as if it was a higher level. So what they've done essentially is remove their consciousness and their awareness of their own experience of their body and their needs. They divorced it from their experience of life. They're like, And the bigger that gap, the bigger that divorce is, right? And these people had some pretty good gaps. The heart group didn't. They felt it. They knew it right on. And what's interesting is when you suppress the stress response consciously, turns out that it launches a larger stress response. Your body has to deal with more stress than you would deal with if you just admitted how stressful it was. But this isn't a conscious thing anymore. Like I said, no baby comes into the world being like, "Oh, it's okay. Mom's busy. I'll just wait. I'm not gonna cry." That doesn't happen. These things are trained, and they're trained mostly through modeling. Because that's how babies learn. That's how kids learn. They learn through observation and through modeling. And we see our parents deny their own needs for our sakes, for their community's sakes, for the family's sakes, for the church's sake, for whatever reason. We see our moms and our parents doing that, and we do it more on ourselves. And then that gets compounded more through our socialization training. Because in order to function as an American, you're like, well, if you want to have an easy life, then basically that's what you need to do. You need to be able to not pee when you want to, because you only get so many breaks. You've got to be able to have a 30-minute lunch break instead of an hour where you're miserable afterward because you eat your food and then you crash for a while, and it's all very, very much a non-negotiable kind of context that you find yourself in. And you're like, okay, well, these are non-negotiable things, so the only thing I can negotiate with are my own needs. And that becomes ingrained into who we are. It's so frustrating because there's nowhere to point the finger. And that's what's so hard, is for me anyway, there's nowhere to point the finger to say, like, this is screwed. Like, this is what did it. There's so many factors at play, and all of them are fundamental to our survival, right? And everybody is just doing the best that they can. But these things can be changed. We can do this, but not until we recognize that this type C personality trait, this good person, is terrible for themselves. It's terrible to be what the world calls such a good person. And Gabor, again, does a great job of displaying this because he has the same pastime that I used to have a long time ago and that many small town folks do have, where he reads the obituaries. And he brought up a couple of obituaries where basically the trend that he was seeing is the same trend that everybody sees in obituaries, is they're like, they're both like fondly remembering them, but they're also in loss. And so obituaries have this interesting vibe to them. And what he found looking at all of them is the things that people talked about the dead people, oftentimes they praised them for the exact psychological and essentially biological, because you cannot separate the two, especially when it comes to repression. Repression is no longer just a psychological framework. It is a biological one that happens automatically, in an automated fashion. But he brought up a woman who was like 55 years old and died of cancer, and how she never stopped doing all of the things that she was doing. Her entire identity was she was coaching, she was doing soccer stuff, and she was doing stuff for her community. And when she got the diagnosis, she dove deeper and did more. She actually took on an additional role. And the thing is, she was described as having no ego. That she would just give and give and give and give and give to everybody around her. And when she got this diagnosis, rather than changing that, she gave more and died. And the thing that her late husband touted her for were the things that we now know are detrimental to health as an individual. And this is the problem, is like our authenticity is good for us as an individual, and our attachment is good for our society. Whether you're at a small scale and you're looking at your family, you're a larger scale and you're looking at your community, or the biggest and you're looking at the whole world. It's our, in a lot of ways, it's our desire for attachment and our need for attachment that drives us to be like, oh, okay, and just accept people for who they are and blah, 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 because, okay, well, they are who they are, I am who I am, and we can still get along. And getting along is like, that's attachment in a way, it's associated with it. So I really wanted to talk about this because Rethinking Broken, my book, when I first started writing it, was specifically and especially for those people who have had big T traumas, or a bunch of trauma, whether big T or little t, but it was for those who, at the time, I was considering 4 or more ACEs. But as I wrote and as I talked to friends, at people who were really excited to hear about the book, I really started to put together that a lot of people, a lot more than I thought, identify as broken. Like way more people than I thought identify as broken or have at some point in their life. People who don't have like big T traumas. People who are like, oh, my childhood was fine. It was okay. It doesn't affect me. Other people had it worse. Those kinds of people are great friends of mine. And it became obvious that they struggle with the exact same things, and they mostly struggle from small T traumas. And that's part of the reason that they struggle, is because like big T traumas, you can make movies about it. It's totally understandable how they have this long-lasting detrimental effect to our health. It's harder to understand, at least from the outside looking in, how these little stressors have such a huge impact on our life and health. But they do. And now like those connections are pretty undeniable, And so in writing and editing and changing my book, I really had to focus on these small T traumas and how they manifest in each of us, because I will never do as good of a job as Gabor Mate on going through all of the science. Like, it's a big book. The book it's a thick book, and it's wonderful, and it does an amazing job of explaining to me in my scientific mind, and to the layperson's mind who's interested in science, these different philosophies and these different processes. But my book is not for the same audience. I'm trying to write from a first person's perspective. I'm trying to write about the perspective from the inside out, how these things manifest in each of us. And that's how I got to this attachment versus authenticity war, which he calls a traumatic tension. And I call it war because it's traumatic. And for some of us, it is a war, and for some of us, it's less so. But the problem with the small t traumas, the less so, is maybe it's not actually that, like, less of a war. Maybe, like, bombs aren't going off, but maybe they did a long time ago. And since then, everybody's, like, walking on eggshells. And if everyone in your life is walking around on eggshells, that's what you're going to learn how to do. And it's very hard for these people, small t people, to call what they experience traumatic. Because it's easy to say, like, not getting hugged by mommy enough is not the same as being raped by dad. And it's not the same. It is absolutely in no way the same, except for in the way that it is the same, which is they're both traumatic. Meaning they both leave a wound that is carried far beyond the event itself. And this type of trauma that I'm talking about between this rub of authenticity and attachment happens all day, every day, throughout our waking lives. There's always this constant battle between, do I express myself authentically or do I not? Because not is almost always safer as far as the external world. And expressing ourselves in the moment is pretty much always safer in our own internal world. That's why it feels so rewarding in the moment. And then later on down the line, maybe 5 minutes later, maybe a few hours later, maybe the next day or the next week, we are like, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But in the moment, it's quite rewarding because it's rewarding to us on an individual level because we stood up for ourselves and we asked for what it is that we needed. But this rub happens constantly because there's never a moment in which we are not balancing our own needs versus the needs of our community, which is where we belong. So if your life is been pretty okay, if you're one of those people who are like, other people had it worse, my childhood was fine, like my parents didn't beat me, just please, 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 please understand that does not mean that you don't carry trauma from that time, and that trauma can easily, and oftentimes does, manifest as personality traits in us as adults. So there are probably personality traits in you that sound a lot like this type C nice person trait that are detrimental. If you find yourself to be a nice person, and you're often described as a nice person in that way, and you find yourself overgiving or suppressing negative emotions for anyone's benefit, that's a trauma response. It's a trauma response to this small t trauma. It's a trauma response to this constant battle between the expression of ourselves and our need for attachment. So that's what I wanted to talk to you guys about today. I think this is one of the single most important conversations that we need to be having, is about this rub between authenticity and attachment, and that this rub is what comprises the other end of the spectrum, this small t end of this trauma spectrum versus the big T being acute and short-lived, and small t being smaller and longer-lived, chronic in nature. These small t traumas, they're so difficult. They can be far more difficult in many cases to deal with than big T traumas, especially if there was only one or two big T traumas. Because in the world of trauma, there's acute, chronic, and complex trauma. And you can probably put together that what acute, chronic both mean now, and the complex is just that you've had multiple kinds of traumatic situations in succession, and because of that, your body has programmed many different types of automated responses, none of which are probably beneficial in the long run, because our body is not designed to understand or comprehend chronic stress. Our bodies are designed for acute stress. So any stress that we have, our response will be appropriate for an acute situation and inappropriate in the long term. So complex trauma is really, really, really complicated to deal with because it manifests as, well, sometimes I respond like this and sometimes I respond like that, and other times it's like this and other times it's totally opposite to that, and then there's these other times that are just this weird in-between that seem totally unrelated, but I find myself having uncontrollable responses in all these variety of ways to all of these varieties of stimulus. And it's really difficult, and I hope that if you're listening, your takeaway from this is the way that we train people to be in our modern world trains them to be sick, mentally and physiologically. The way that we train children to deny their own internal reality for ease of the moment or the community or the togetherness of the family, that is fundamentally detrimental to the health of that person. But it works really well for our society because then we're happy little do-gooders. And we can die from cancer at 55 from an inability to cope with stress in a different way than we were programmed as a child. That's the problem with these things, is what started off as a coping mechanism eventually ekes its way into our personalities. Like, we are what we do, right? And if we're constantly coping with stress, what we are is the process, in a way, of how we deal with stress, because we all do it differently. You know, we all have the fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses. We typically go with fight or flight. When that fight or flight stress response gets launched in us, we can choose to move toward or move away. That's the fight or flight. But as children, we don't get to do that. As children, we can't fight. And we can't flee either because we're dependent upon our parents. They're much bigger than us if we did want to fight them. And if I'm talking physically or logically or emotionally, because at the end of the day, mom still has because I'm your mother and because I said so and because it's my house and it's my rules. They still have that card to pull. So even if you were able to find a justifiable way, say as a teenager or something, to be like, here's a rational explanation for this, they're still just going to be like, hey, fuck you. Not everybody, not all the time, but that definitely happens. There is not a parent alive, as far as I'm concerned, that hasn't waited for their child to turn around and be like, fucking inside themselves, right? But what I'm getting at is that children are frustrating. They're extremely frustrating. And we have to deal with them. And this rub between their expression of their own needs is almost impossible to deal with in a society and a culture in which parents' needs are anything but met. They are anything but met. So how can we teach them to do better? And the answer is to stop repressing our own emotions, find better ways of coping and dealing with it. They can't do that, but we can. As adults, we have the ability to retrain our brains and to retrain our neurology. It's hard work. It takes consistent effort over time. It takes a systematic approach, but it's absolutely doable. And if we want to win this war, what we need to do is be able to feel our own emotions when they arise, honor them in one way or another, and display that to our kids. And to teach them that they are having experiences, emotions, feelings, thoughts that are true to them, and expressing that, knowing that, staying in contact primarily, staying in contact with those emotions, with those biological imperatives that keep us alive in a survival situation on the savannah, like running away from a lion. Those gut instincts give us something. They feed us something. They are innate to us, and if we don't honor them, that creates a actual biochemical cascade that creates changes in your neurology to allow you to adapt to the fact that expressing yourself is not an option. So we have to teach how to express and how to feel what it is that we feel and honor that, whether we can express it or not. If we suppress our own internal wisdom, because that's what it is. All emotions are somatic experiences. Emotions start as a physiological experience in the body that we then name with with labels that we call anger or greed or excitement or joy or whatever. But they're all somatic experiences, and they all give us information that that is not consciously available to us. And when we lose that, we lose our own health. So we have to learn to stay in our own bodies and to keep a somewhat realistic view of how stressed we are. Because this authenticity versus attachment is most of the existential dread that we have as a society, short of like climate change. Everything else is about the sense of belonging versus this sense of autonomy. We have to learn to balance those two things. And that's what I'm hoping to at least bring up and start this conversation. I know it's really hard to hear, and I'm probably beating a dead horse at this point, but being what's like quote unquote a good person in the modern world, it's not a death sentence, but damn, it is incredibly detrimental. It is so detrimental. It's so detrimental to our body, to our minds, and to eventually our society and our culture. Because what we have done and are doing is we are training people to be sick and not know it. Because going back to that study where they tested stress on the three different groups, if we don't know how stressed we are, if we don't know how much stress we're carrying in our everyday lives, how are we going to do anything about it? We know that stress, well, it's called oxidative stress. Stress causes this oxidation in the body that creates all the inflammation that is ultimately the end result of all diseases and aging. So we have to learn how to deal with it. We have to learn one way or another to be able to be true to our experiences and understand where we are and who we are and the roles that we play in society and try to balance the two. And unfortunately, a healthy balance, healthy meaning healthy for the body, healthy for the individual, is not, at least it doesn't seem to me, is not going to be beneficial to the society. So those are my takeaways. Please understand if you see yourself as a type C type of person, we already know type A has health effects. We're like, oh, you can't be that angry all the time. So then we learn to repress anger. Well, it turns out that repressing anger is just as detrimental to the health as just being angry all the time. In fact, in the short term, for the body's experience, it's more stressful to the body to suppress the anger, which is why we'll suppress it long enough, it eventually becomes repressed. And then it's a biological experience. So you don't consciously register how stressed you are. And this is very, very true for small t trauma people. And I think this is why the small t trauma people don't seek as much help, but need to. They need to because they're the majority of the world. There is nobody who gets out of life alive, and nobody had a free ride. These small t people are the heart. That's the bread and butter of the people who are struggling with their own mental health and the people who are raising the next generation of children and are thinking that they're okay when they're not. Like there's a lot of folks running around who think that they're okay because convincing themselves that they've been okay, repeating that as a mantra has been how they have learned to survive their whole life. And that then gets imprinted in the next generation. And they deny and deny and deny and try their best to be good people because they don't have any excuses, because they don't have big T trauma. They only have this little t trauma that they think didn't affect them. But it does. It affects us by creating an entire society of nice people. of nice, good, liberal people who have actually, I found a study about a year and a half ago, where it turns out that conservative people who identify, at least in the US, as conservative, not regarding political leanings, but just they identify as a conservative person, typically have less stress in their body. They live typically with less stress, whereas self-proclaimed liberal people live with more stress because they're actually concerned about the people other than themselves, the theoretical groups of individuals and how to navigate them. So there it is, y'all. There is my take on the attachment versus authenticity war. It is fundamental that we experience and express both attachment and authenticity for health and our society, as well as, I honestly think, just life. Life is hard, and I think this is one of the reasons that life is hard. Whether you're in a sick society or not, you're going to have this struggle of attachment versus authenticity. But the way that we as a society have created our priorities is really detrimental to the health of its constituents. If you've made it this far in the podcast, thank you for listening. This has been a fun one for me, and I hope that you got something out of it. Attachment and authenticity are both fundamental aspects of survival, and we need to be able to engage in both of them. And unfortunately, authenticity often gets fallen to the wayside, except for in people with lots of big T traumas who because of that decided, fuck this, I will be me no matter what. That would be me. I'm one of those people. So I get to see it from one perspective. I hope that you guys enjoyed this. If you did, consider subscribing and consider donating on Patreon or buy me a coffee. Everything will be in the description box below. If you have any questions and want to get a hold of me, or you want to schedule a free 15-minute coaching call, you can do that. I will link directly to my website, and it'll pull you on, and my whole schedule is already up there. All you got to do is click on a time that works for you, and you can schedule a free 15-minute call with me, and I would love that. So, thank you guys for listening. Thank you for your time and attention. I know that you have 1,000 things you could be listening to, and you chose this. Thank you very much for that. I hope that you have a fantastic week, and remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.